Ladies and gentlemen, Brad Henderson. How you doing, Brad?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks so much for carving out the time for us at Fireside Chicago. Much appreciated. So for those, I guess a good place to start, I've been following P33 since the inception. Listeners of the show know I'm very passionate about the growth of the technology community in Chicago, the growth of Chicago in general. For those that aren't aware, could you just start by telling us a little bit about P33?
Sure. Yeah. So P33 was birthed by civic leaders in Chicago about 3.5, 4 years ago. And it really started with a simple premise. So the Civic Committee, which is where it's called 50, 60 of the most senior CEOs and university presidents in Chicago have gotten together for decades and decades and decades to solve hard problems for Chicago. When Secretary Pritzker came back from DC, she said, maybe one of the problems we should think about is how does Chicago in our region position ourselves for the new economy, for the innovation economy, for the tech economy. And actually, Oscar Munoz of United Airlines, as part of that group, said, well, we should probably understand the problem before we try to fix it. And so I was fortunate enough, it started as a group of, say, 40 or so volunteers. I was a senior partner at the Boston Consulting Group. And we, like a few other consulting firms, offered our free services to study the problem. And we spent about 1.5 years working together. It became 400 leaders, about 700 megabytes of research. And it really pointed to what are the key puzzles in front of Chicago that we need to solve if we want to live into our full potential from an innovation perspective. And so P33 was at that point a volunteer army. And I was asked to be the CEO of what then became a full-time organization. That was about 2 years ago. We now have 15 people on staff, a board of 20 folks. We've got 2 or 3 big problems we're working on that the data says really matter. And we're in the fight every day, really trying to fight on behalf of Chicago. The P stands for people, and the 33 actually stands for 2033. Which is the 100th anniversary of the World's Fair and the 200th anniversary of the founding of Chicago. And really the premise is by the year 2033, how do we ensure that Chicago is rightfully regarded as one of the global leaders in these fields? And how do we all work together to make it happen?
Say I'm 21 years old. I just graduated from university. I don't know how Chicago stacks up to other cities. Well, why would this be important to me as I look to raise a family here in Chicago and grow my career here in Chicago?
Economies change, right? And so I'm actually from just outside of Cincinnati, and in the 19th century, Cincinnati was a lot bigger than Chicago. It was a booming metropolis, and people went there because the river created job opportunities. Every city has to respond to new economic eras. And what's fascinating about Chicago is it's been pretty darn resilient, right? So if you compare Chicago to most Midwestern cities, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, et cetera, we made that transition from a Rust Belt city to a knowledge city very well. The question becomes, all right, if I want to live in the Midwest, with the climate and the values and all the things that come with that, families close, et cetera, where do I want to build my career? Where can I find an affordable place to live with great cultural amenities, world-class educational opportunities, great ways to build my career? It's still very much the case that, and the data bears this out, Chicago is the capital, the cultural capital, the business capital, the Mecca of the Midwest. And so for anybody looking for that kind of life in the middle of the country, there's not much better option. That's just a fabulous place to do that. But that being said, we, of course, compete against New York and LA. And so we need an argument for why can we be a great global city like those two places? And the reality against those places is we're more affordable. You take a Nashville or an Austin or some of those places, they're clearly growing faster than Chicago. But they don't have University of Chicago, Northwestern, Argonne National Labs, Fermi, University of Illinois, et cetera. And so it's still this just incredibly unique place where you get down to earth way of living, affordable with world-class amenities and a great way to grow your career. There's really nothing else like it in the United States.
It's interesting to hear you say that, like Dayton, Ohio, big manufacturing city, globalization, manufacturing kind of goes away. What does that happen to the city? And I don't think, unless someone like yourself peels back the layers, that people realize that like everything is based on the economy.
Yes.
Like you need to have job opportunities, you need to get salaries with those jobs that pays for like lunch and dinner and facilities and real estate and all this kind of stuff. And it all kind of feeds back into the system. So P33 is basically saying, how do we get Chicago a foothold in the digital innovative economy? So primarily the technology community, like it's all about tech jobs, innovation. Tech companies are the way of the future. How do we kind of get those jobs here? And
I think, and what I would just briefly interject there is, tech doesn't just mean computer software, right? And so tech can be in food and ag, tech can be in life sciences, tech can be in industrial. And so, one of the really unique things about Chicago is it's actually where tech meets the real world. And so we can't ignore the tech part of the real world. But our operating system needs to be rebooted to work for a digitally intensive economy. And that's a real challenge we got to work on together.
So you were at Boston Consulting Group, big consulting background. You do this project for Chicago, the state of Illinois, over a period of a year. What were some of like the key findings? What were some of like the opportunities, positives, and then what was like, hey, by 2033 we need to really take a look at this?
Sure. So the headline finding was that if you think about it almost as a business, you have a balance sheet, which is all of your assets and your strengths, and a P&L, which is essentially how much economic output is that balance sheet creating every year. And what's fascinating about Chicago is that what our data said is we have one of the third or fourth strongest innovation balance sheets in the country. Our universities, our companies, our talent base, et cetera. And yet our outcomes, as measured by GDP, job growth, et cetera, are not in the top tier. And so this is a mismatch, right? Why do we have all these strengths and yet the performance of those assets isn't what you want it to be? Then you start to peel it back, and there are a couple other findings that we have that we're working on very aggressively. The first big one is related to the translation of science into companies. So by many measures, Chicago has the third best science in the country. And we're not in the top 10 in turning science into jobs. And that is just a massive loss of economic opportunity. It's Cincinnati, Ohio. We do not have the same science that Chicago does. If you think about everything from making new pharmaceuticals to autonomous vehicles, et cetera, that's all based on cutting edge research. Most of the battery research that Tesla and Apple use comes from Argonne National Labs, but that's not what jobs are. And so there's a whole thread of work we need to do about taking that science, that research, and making it actually affect our economy, which is a related thing, but not the same thing.
Well, the next thing. Sorry, go. I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
Just very briefly, the two other things that we found were we are a powerhouse at producing technical talent. So I think we have the second largest market for computer science graduates in the country. University of Illinois is the #4 computer science school in the country. It graduates more computer scientists than the other top 5 schools combined. So that should be a huge strength. And yet, when you look at the retention of that talent, people leave. And we can, Mark Andreessen, the Larry Ellison. I mean, Silicon Valley is sort of littered with folks who went to University of Illinois and then moved somewhere else, right? So that's problem number 2 we identified of the leaky balance sheet. And the last one is just where capital goes, right? So we've actually succeeded in building a pretty good seed stage capital market for our venture-backed companies. Very little of that capital goes to women and people of color. Very little of it goes to consumer businesses, science-based businesses. And so our capital markets, which are really good in private equity and hedge funds, et cetera, how do we actually make them for emerging entrepreneurs? So those are the 3 parts that our research said, if you tackle those problems, you can make a big mark.
Is there a current city that's, in your opinion and in your mind, doing things well, or is kind of a poster child for what we're trying to do? Or does every city kind of have their own challenges similar to Chicago?
I see. So the data, when we studied this very deeply, we looked at nearly every city, says there's no perfect analog for Chicago, right? So we do ourselves a service by not trying to replicate Silicon Valley or New York or Nashville. But each city offers its own lessons to learn from. And so, if you said to me, where do we need to learn the most from? Like, which city offers us the most that we could learn? I really do think that Boston is our mark. It's much smaller than Chicago. So in that regard, it just doesn't have the complexity of a very large global city. But if you look at Boston, if you'd gone to Boston in the 1990s and you go back again today, you'd say, whoa, this was a sleepy provincial town with a couple of good universities and some financial services companies. And now it's the epicenter of a lot of the cutting edge companies around the world. And what they did that we can do that we haven't done yet is they built this incredible entrepreneurial network around Harvard and MIT. And we have Harvard and MIT. They're called University of Chicago and Northwestern.
That's right.
And then throw in Urbana to match, and I think we got them beat. But they've done such a better job at making them the core of how they built that innovation economy. I think we have a lot to learn from them. And if we capture that essence, the sky's the limit for Chicago.
It's such a loaded topic just in general. You have to keep the talent here. You have to get these companies funded. You have to identify what are good opportunities at the university, what's getting grants and research and development opportunities. And then you have to keep it here. You have to have the other ancillary talent to scale these organizations, right? But when you look at a Boston, because you know a lot more than I do, but all the med device companies that I know of are there, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, robotics companies are based out of there. How did they tactically fill that gap between what was going on at the universities and get it into commerce?
Yeah. So there's, as the story is written, there are probably two or three things that really matter. The first is MIT and Harvard, in some regards, buried the hatchet, right? So universities in the same town have a way of looking at one another as the enemy in some regards. And I went to University of Chicago. My wife went to Northwestern, so I know all about that. But there are around the Kendall Square area, which is sits between those two campuses. It became the symbol for, well, we may have different campuses, but we're going to do our innovation work in the same place. And so that they actually were very intentional in finding ways to support the scientists who said, I don't want to get a Nobel Prize, I want to go build a company. There are a whole series of things they did to support those individuals together. And we haven't quite figured it out that yet. There's some ideas in Chicago, there's some projects that are emerging, but we don't have our Kendall Square moment yet between our research universities and our national labs. The second thing is I do think they had incredible leadership at the state level. And that's Republican and Democrats. Their governors invested in policy, in education programs, in research programs, et cetera, that said, this is where we want to go. And I think Chicago and Illinois have had that more in fits and starts. And I still think it's fair to say our state policies haven't quite gotten there. We have a new governor who's working on those things, whose background is in tech. But we did not have that over the period from really Mitt Romney to their current Governor Baker. They were very intentional about building the infrastructure to do this work.
I remember when we spoke kind of in preparation for today, we had talked about just that first kind of year or so of P33. I remember seeing it. There was a lot of buzz around it. You were able to corral lots of leaders in the business community, in the technology community. There was, I think, maybe dozens or so that were, and these are busy people. They have day jobs. That they're doing well, obviously. How did you get that? How did you corral all those folks to get integrated and synced kind of towards a common goal for the city of Chicago?
So that's one of the very unique things about Chicago, right? And it started generations ago with business leaders, which is this mindset of the civic matters nearly as much as the commercial. And in my career at BCG, I traveled to nearly every city in the U.S. and many cities around the world. And I think it's fairly unparalleled, right? If you go to New York City, there's 6 or 7 different epicenters of civic business power that don't work together that closely. It's just very rare to have a place where, I mean, if you go and read the history of the Boeing recruitment to Chicago, it was everybody, every single senior business executive pitching in to the cause. And it is a way of life. And there's actually a sociologist at Booth, I think his name is Ronald Kurtz, who has shown the network map of civic leaders in Chicago is the densest in the country. And so in some sense, you're kind to point out that we pulled a lot of people together to do this work, but that's just Chicago, right? It's the kind of place where typically, if you call and ask for help, people help. And so I actually think it was merely the thought of saying, we're going to ask, we're going to run a structured process, we're going to resource this in the right way, and we're going to do something with it when we're done. So there wasn't a lot of arm twisting. A lot of it was, your predecessor did this, and her predecessor did this, et cetera. We're going to do it again for Chicago.
And then once you got volunteers, everyone's kind of on board. What happened from there to kind of identify some of the opportunities that are here for P33?
So it was 2 things that were done. The first was lots and lots of research, right? So we were out, McKinsey was out doing detailed research of tech leaders around the country on Net Promoter Score information, right? So really valuable information. It basically says, what do you really think about Chicago versus Austin versus Boston, et cetera? You had a BCG team literally flying around the country, taking business leaders to places that were doing things well for field trips, and debriefing rooms where a university president and a chief strategy officer for a company and a philanthropic leader are debriefing and just saying, how do we learn these lessons and bring them back to Chicago? So it was a lot of deep digging from an analytical perspective. And then it was actually, I think there were 4 subgroups, and they were given homework, right? And so it was super senior leaders with storied histories in Chicago saying, your job is to come back in 2 months with what you think we should do. And they took it very seriously, and they came back with really high quality ideas. And so at the end of that process, you had 400 people who've gone deep into data and brought out their best ideas. And so when I started the organization, our team did, as a formal 501c3, I got to start with all that, which made my job a heck of a lot easier.
And then out of those findings, there had to be a lot. Like, where do you start? How do you create like a 3-year plan, 5-year plan, reverse engineer that? What do we do? What do we do year 1? How did that process roll out for you?
It's really hard, right? So the way we always humbly joke about it is, it's $1 trillion economy with 10 million people. That's our remit, and I had 10 people, right? So you think about the resources to try to tackle a problem that big. And so the first thing we did is we took those 3 problems I described to you, right? We took the science problem, the talent problem, and the capital problem. And you start to dig in and say, well, okay, what are the subdimensions beneath that? And then when you get into those, you start to say, do I want to build something? Or do I want to bring people together to come up with a different solution? Or do I want to take an existing solution that exists somewhere in our region and try to reform it and make it work better? And so, in an area like talent, there had been an idea on the table around the creation of a University of Illinois campus, innovation campus in Chicago called DPI, Discovery Partners Institute. That had some momentum, but it stalled a bit. And we saw that as an opportunity for a transformational change. If you take the 4th best computer science school in the country, which is 2.5-hour drive from downtown Chicago, and find a way to put a big plant right in the middle of downtown Chicago with that organization. So DPI, we helped write their business plan. We helped them apply to the state for funding. They've gotten $500 million. They now have a very large staff in Chicago every day trying to create that bridge between University of Illinois and downtown Chicago. in the next couple of years, a world-class research institution will be right in the heart of Chicago because of that work. So that was an example of almost like recruiting a new institution to serve us. And so every single one of the things we work on has a bit of a unique solution. It was about rolling up your sleeves, getting into the detail, and saying, what's the best way to solve this sub problem?
Interesting. I had left, let's call it corporate America, in January of 2016. I was part of like an old school industry, staffing, operated the same way since the 50s. And we worked with manufacturing companies. And then when I started my entrepreneurial journey, I started the network in downtown Chicago, and I started mentoring at 1871 and interacted with some of the angel investment groups and just kind of got around the community. And I was so like in awe and inspired around just like the buzz of just around helping each other out. There was just this sense of, oh, he's trying to do this over there. Like, how do we get some resources around him? She's trying to do this over here. How do we get some resources around her? And it was just, inspiring in a lot of ways. And then you fast forward 5 years, and then on the outset, it seems like we got more venture capital money coming into the space. It seems like there's more private equity firms coming in and adding the capital element. There's more unicorns even this year, based on kind of fundraising rounds that have happened. On the surface, it looks like things are headed in the right direction, even despite a COVID year where, there was some layoff activity, and some of the coastal companies that had regional headquarters in Chicago maybe kind of pulled out a little bit, but it seems like things are headed in the right direction. What is your take on things maybe that are going well to date now that you've been kind of doing this for a few years, and then still some of those areas of opportunity where we kind of need to fast forward some of that advancement?
What a great question. And I love your observations about 5 years ago. And I can tell you, I'm such a massive beneficiary of the generosity of a lot of really smart, hardworking people in the tech community in Chicago. It's just incredible. The reality is, from a tech perspective, Chicago is just kicking ass right now. And there have been 2 really good articles written that are, don't take my word for it, articles. So there's a great profile in Fast Company, maybe a month or 2 ago. And then yesterday, TechCrunch did a fairly comprehensive analysis of it's basically why Chicago should be a way bigger story, right? The way I draw that conclusion. I think every ecosystem has its challenges, but the reality is we've become a grown-up tech market in a short span. I think, so why does everyone not know that story? Some of it is, I think it's easy to write national narratives around places like Miami and Nashville and Denver and a few other places where the data just says those narratives are way overhyped. Right? It's a fun story to write. Once you write it, somebody gets credit for writing it again and promoting it, et cetera. And so some of what's happened is there are a few other cities who I think have captured an outsized share relative to what the data says on why they're growing and what's actually happening there. I think Chicago is also burdened, rightfully so, by some challenging issues around crime, right? I mean, it is hard to get past that. And, in a lot of the national media, Chicago is almost like a proxy for crime. And so how do you cut through that, right? Because there are 3 million people who live in this city, and crime affects them, and it's a tragedy, but that's not the only thing that defines us. And so I think the challenge for Chicago right now is to take that data, to take those stories, to take the incredible successes we've seen this year in companies like M1 Finance, which I don't know if you profiled them, but that is a company that, unlike Robinhood, cares about its customers and is providing something that's going to make them healthy from a financial perspective for a very long time, and making money and growing it at the same time. I see Robinhood every time I pick up the Wall Street Journal and the picture of those 2 founders. I don't see Brian, their founder, enough, right? And so he's now a unicorn. Great news. But that's a Chicago company doing things the right way. How do we get more of those stories out and really let people know you can build a hell of a business here?
I think part of what I realized, just kind of immersing myself in the community, is when others around you are doing the same thing, or if somebody that's already done what you're trying to do is lending a helping hand, the obstacles become a lot smaller. You build more confidence in yourself. You feel like you have a big brother, a big sister you can kind of go to. And I've met some of these unicorn folks that you're talking about 4 years ago when they were getting started, right? And to see that kind of confidence build. And I think I've benefited in my own business. I'm 3 years in, and just, the way that you describe leaders in Chicago and helping each other out. It's that now on the flip side, and I think I opened my eyes to this much more than ever before, right, wrong, or indifferent last year with the diversity, equity, and inclusion, everything that was going on with Black Lives Matter. And it shined a spotlight, I feel, on just the major gap that we have across the country, but specifically in Chicago. And how do we give other people opportunities that maybe grew up in a different neighborhood than other folks did? That same feeling of, hey, I got people around me that are supporting me. There's people that are invested in my success, and maybe make some of those other obstacles a little bit smaller for underappreciated, underserved communities as well. So let's talk about diversity a little bit and some of the statistics, or maybe some of the challenges that you see from your seat.
So that's an opportunity or a challenge we're deeply invested in at P33. So if you had to pick the 2 or 3 things that we have to get right, that's on the list. And so we've started by studying it a lot, and then we've taken quite a bit of action that we're excited about, and I can talk more about. So the data is bad, right? So it says that Chicago is a city that's over 60% people of color, and they get less than 3% of the venture funding. I'm not, I didn't major in math in college, but I know that that's like bad. It's a bad ratio to have.
Small number, yep.
And we have this incredible program we call Tech Rise that I'll talk about a little bit. That's very focused on addressing the exact challenge you're describing in a very data-driven way. But the woman who leads that program for us, her name is Desiree Vargas Wrigley. She's a 2-time Latina founder in Chicago. Probably one of the most talented and passionate people I've ever met. Her journey has been really hard in Chicago, right? So both of her businesses are businesses you describe as more oriented towards people of color and women. And they from lived experience, right? So she started a business that essentially creates a marketplace for activities for kids that's addressing what mom's challenges are. And when she walks into venture capital offices and says, here's my idea, they say, this doesn't seem that hard. I think my wife does this. It doesn't seem like we need to fund a company to go do this. I don't understand that problem, right? That's not a problem that is relevant to me as a 52-year-old former dad. And so think about that, right? I mean, she doesn't have the network. The investors don't understand her problem. And yet what's really cool about it is an actual problem. And there's lots of data that says there's money to be made in here. And so how would you redesign a system that actually works for someone like her? And so that's what she's working on. And so TechRise, the program she's working on, it's been in a process about 6 months now. The results have been ridiculously successful. It's the key insight is that you can't build a pipeline of diverse founders if they don't get started. And they don't get started because they don't have access to seed or pre-seed capital, and they don't have networks to do the work. And so think about friends and family, right? I grew up pretty middle class, but I knew enough people that could help me raise $50,000. Mm-hmm. If you're Hispanic or African-American in Chicago, there's a good chance you can't raise that amongst your friends and family. And so the $5 million fund that we raise, every week we give out $20,000 to $50,000 to one a Chicago entrepreneur. That's their friends and family round.
Got it.
And then you give them network that says, okay, well, the next thing I need to do is build a website, implement a CRM system, build an MVP, et cetera. And so anyway, the whole premise behind the program is look at the actual barriers, right? Not sit on panels and talk about things, not some late stage private equity fund for which there are not enough businesses mature enough to take that money. Mm-hmm. Actually get into the reality of challenges facing diverse entrepreneurs in Chicago and start tackling it with real resource. That's what we think is possible here. We got a long way to go.
I love it. Maybe last topic, and I appreciate your time. We talked about branding a little bit. You kind of just talked about the crime kind of outlook on the city of Chicago. And when I just think about how do we fix that? Like, I just think like general media, digital and social media just plays such a big part in our society, like what's the answer there to really kind of shed a spotlight on it? Like, do we need to get Hollywood involved? Like the two shows that come up for Chicago, or the fire department show and the police show, where like tragedies are happening? How do we get a Silicon Valley here? How do we get a documentary filmmaker, out here, just, so kids can see it, so people can get inspired by it and maybe want to be a part of it. What is that kind of answer to affect kind of the branding component? I'm sure that's a loaded question.
So one thing I will say that we can do is actually make progress reducing crime. And so that's and if you think about, we had a period of about 10 years of actually reducing gun crime in Chicago. And so that is a real opportunity for people in tech to join the civic conversation, right? I mean, we all live in Chicago. And I think too often we say, well, I see that's going on. Maybe I'll just move further out into the suburbs, or I'll spend most of my time working from Boston or whatever it is, right? So step one was we could actually make a dent in that. And I think that's possible. From then a marketing perspective, it actually turns out that it's like any marketing problem, where if you organize the facts, you build a narrative around it, you identify who you want to tell, you identify what channels and which messages they want to listen to that will affect their opinion, you can change it. And we just have underinvested in that. And so we actually have a marketing campaign that we've been building with the community all around Chicago's tech brand. And the initial results, I think we've got a couple million impressions with the work we've done so far, is you can actually change people's minds. And so the initiative we built is something, we started that, so you got to start with what segment do we want to change? So the one we've been working on, there are people we call boomerangs, people who lived here and left, who have the skills we need to grow our tech economy, but chose to build their adult professional career in San Francisco or Seattle or Austin or something. So the initiative we built is called Come Back to Move Forward. We've done it in partnership with World Business Chicago in 1871, and M-Hub at the University of Illinois and Northwestern, University of Chicago, et cetera. So Brian Barnes at M1 and Chris Gladwin at OCM, this big coalition. We built a brand that Energy BBDO built that's steeped in research, and we're out there. If you lived in San Francisco and we're on LinkedIn today, and we had data that says you're from Chicago, you probably got a message in your stream saying, did you know this is the house you can get for $3 million in San Francisco and the one you can get in Chicago? Come back to move forward. Did you know there are 50 growth stage companies in Chicago with several thousand job openings today in Chicago? To learn more, et cetera. And so that's what we're doing. We're building and to get people back.
It's a very tactical play that companies do every single day, and it just makes a lot of sense. I love that.
Why not do it? If you've built this incredible network through all of your work over the years, and all the other entrepreneurs you work with, you all have hiring needs, right? And if everyone just says, well, I'm going to try to tell the Chicago story exclusively on my own, and hire my own recruiter, and you do battle with the whole narrative of Chicago nationally all by myself, versus why don't we all tell Chicago's story together and say, well, if you don't join Oak Street or M1, come join Avant or Amount or Tavala. Like, it turns out we all want you back here because amongst all of our companies, they're great opportunities. So it's a bit of like bringing the communal leadership into the branding exercise is what we're working on.
I love it. I love it. You mentioned Chris and Brian over at M1. Has there been somebody or a couple of people that have stood out as just great partners in this effort, or maybe they're not a part of the day-to-day at P33, but just really kind of help you take the bull by the horns and are aligned in kind of the goal that you've set out?
Yeah, it's really hard to pick, but I'll say a few things. So I will say, I can't think of a person who hasn't been willing to help. Some of them are tougher customers or critics, right? So I actually love that, right? When you walk into somebody in the office and they say, I appreciate what you're doing, but I think it's a waste of time. That's when I listen more, because usually they're onto something. But I would say there are a few folks who've made a huge difference. So one of our board members, a guy called Gary Cooper at Repley, and that guy's done anything and everything we've ever asked him to do, and is probably one of the most effective brand ambassadors for Chicago you can possibly imagine, right? And he's building a hell of a company. Chris Gladwin is a stud, right? So
Totally.
What's incredible to me is, Chris is he's a tech entrepreneur's tech entrepreneur. He's building Silicon Valley-like businesses in Chicago. And what he basically, when people come to him and say, I can't do it in Chicago, he says, of course you can. You just got to do it the right way. Come spend a little time with me and I'll tell you how I do it. Like, how do I outcompete Facebook and Google for talent? Is the model that Chris has built for himself, and he wants to share that with Chicago. The list gets quite long with people, but one of the other ones that just fascinates me, who I think doesn't get the attention that he deserves, is a guy, the founder of Oak Street Health, which it's a $15 billion company.
Very quiet success story for what they built over there.
And think about what their business model is, right? It's they provide high quality care. They build a tech business or a new economy business, providing high quality care to old, predominantly underrepresented populations. And they started it in Chicago, right? And they get paid more money the healthier their patients are. And so if I can't think of a business that needs to get built more than one that provides better care to underserved populations in a way that can scale and make money. Mike does everything the right way. You don't read about all the work he's done with COVID vaccines and testing, occupying schools on the west side of Chicago on the weekend, doing it all for free. And so I think there are lots of versions of that story in Chicago. I could write a book about all the people who inspire me, but those are just a few I would mention.
I love it. I love it. Brad, this is awesome. I really appreciate you carving out the time. I think, you do this Monday through Friday. And I think if you're listening to this, we could all help, right? Like, you could be a junior sales rep and, you could push the diversity initiative at your company. You could get the word out about Chicago to the folks that you went to college with. We could all kind of do this. And I think the greater good kind of mentality is kind of what we're talking about here. And I think that's probably going to be what it takes to get all these initiatives accomplished. But for folks that want to check out P33, where can they learn more about P33?
Go to p33chicago.com and you'll get all the latest and greatest. So we have in there our priorities and the latest news. And worst comes to worst, we're in the West Fulton market area. Swing by, knock on the door. We're open for business and looking to really catalyze that greater good sense to make sure Chicago is as strong 10 years from now as it was, at its founding. So really excited about that. Thank you
awesome,
very
Brad.
much for the time, by the way, and all you're doing for Chicago.
I appreciate that. All right, we'll talk soon, Brad. Thanks so much for the time.
Have a great day.